It's a pleasure to be here because as Oliver said, because there was the travel ban, so we had a lot of going back and forth on whether or not I will be able to make it here or not. So I'm really glad I did. No pressure, huh? Okay, so earlier this month, the new Smashing Magazine redesign has been launched. You can find it at next.smashingmagazine.com. 8 months before that, Vitaly contacted me and asked me to build a front-end foundation for the magazine. I definitely said yes. Daniel Moll was the designer and creative director of the project. Now, Dan, if you know Dan's work, it's beautiful, and he has all of these beautiful ideas. So he came up with a lot of beautiful ideas for the magazine. These beautiful ideas ended up being a challenge for me when the time came for implementation. I found myself having to look beyond my then current arsenal of CSS techniques. I had to look for more creative ways to build the ideas that he had designed. And I found myself being challenged on more than just one level, on a new level that is beyond the technical one. You see, as front-end developers, we're required not only to make decisions, technical decisions, like which framework should I use, if any. I don't use any frameworks, but one of the technical decisions that we should make. But we should also be thinking about the consequences of those technical decisions on the user experience. Okay? Now, we should be thinking about, just reiterate, we should be thinking about the consequences of those decisions on the user experience. Because, as every good developer knows, user experience trumps developer convenience. And in the quest for more creative ways to build those creative design challenges, we find ourselves using a lot of hacks. And hacks are risky. They risk a good experience. And believe me, I found myself using a lot of hacks when I was building the magazine. So when we're making those technical decisions, we need to think about how it's going to affect the user experience. More specifically, we need to think of whether or not when a person comes to our websites and starts using our interface, will they be able to use it? Will they be able to consume the content regardless of their context, regardless of their abilities or lack thereof? So the aim of this talk is, I will be talking a lot about some of the creative and hacky techniques that I used, but the main aim of this talk is to prove that accessibility and creativity can go hand in hand. I know that a lot of designers and developers find accessibility boring, and they try to avoid it as much as possible because they think that if I have to think about accessibility, then it's going to hinder my ability to get creative with the way I design or the way I code things. I even have a friend of mine who told me recently that a designer in their company recently left the company because web design is hard. He said, and I quote, "It was all good until all of this user experience and accessibility bullshit came up." Well, flash news. Web design is hard. And if he thinks that user experience and accessibility is bullshit, then he should probably not be designing experiences at all. Okay, so it's not an either-or situation. You don't have to be either creative or think about accessibility. You can do both. In fact, the alternative title of this talk was Creatively Inclusive, Inclusively Creative, because you can be creatively inclusive. Inclusive means creating accessible components, accessible interfaces that are inclusive of every single user everywhere who uses your websites and applications. And you can be inclusively creative. You can be creative while also making sure that what you're building in a creative way is also accessible. And if there's only one thing you take away from this talk today, I want it to be this. Creative doesn't have to mean inaccessible, and accessible doesn't necessarily mean boring. In fact, I'm going to take it even further and say that thinking about accessibility in the early stages of your design and development process can sometimes spark your creativity more and can push you further to come up with even more creative techniques and solutions that not only work for you on a technical level, but they can help make your interfaces inclusive of a broader spectrum of users. I'm going to show some examples from Smashing Magazine, and just so I don't have to take extra time, I'm going to dive right in. So I'm going to start with typography, and specifically controlling rate of scale, while also making sure that what we're doing is still accessible. So when you're building websites and applications, responsive websites and applications, one of the basics is to make sure that the font size changes as the viewport size changes. Now in CSS, we have these properties, the viewport VH, VW, Vmin, Vmax, that are relative to the viewport, the size of the viewport. Okay? Viewport percentage lengths are relative to the viewport. When the height or width of the viewport is changed, they should be scaled accordingly. Every 1 VH, for example, is equal to 1% of the viewport height, 1 VW, 1% of the viewport width. Now combine these features with font size, the font size property, and you'll be able to create text that changes size as the viewport size changes. So in this case here, I have a heading. I've set the font size to be 10 VW, 10% of the viewport width. So as the viewport size decreases, so does the font size of the heading. And as it increases, the font size increases as well. Now, the first problem, there are two problems here. The first problem is that if the viewport size becomes too small, so if you're viewing your website on an Apple Watch, for example, or wherever, any tiny screen, the text is going to be literally unreadable. And if it's too large, the text is going to be too large. Now, you can solve this using a media query like this. For example, and I'm just giving an example here. For example, on screens that are less than 640 pixels wide, I want the font size to be 16 pixels, so it's no longer relative to the viewport. So we're setting a minimum font size and making sure that the text does not go below that font size. Using another media query, you can do the same for larger screens, so we've solved that problem. But in the range where we're still using viewport units to resize the heading, we have an even more important accessibility problem. So this is text that I have. I think it's 5 viewport width in this case here. What I'm trying to do here is trying to scale the text up and down. See up there? It's not scaling up. It's not scaling down. Now, I don't know about you, and I may be getting old, but I can't even begin to count the number of times I've had to zoom text in and out of pages because design happens. This is unacceptable, totally unacceptable. Now, it turns out that by combining viewport units with other units, pixels or ems or whatever, we give the user back the ability to zoom the text in and out. Simple as that. Now, ideally, with the top maximum and minimum font size, ideally we would have something like min font size and max font size in CSS, but we don't have those. So what would be even better is instead of specifying media queries and setting the font size inside of each of those media queries, we would be able to tell the browser to scale the text up and down with the viewport size in just one line of CSS. And all the while solving this whole zooming problem. And apparently there is a way. This way was created by Mike Riethmuller. He's brilliant when it comes to web typography. Totally worth a follow. So if you have something like this, using the CSS calc function, we tell the browser that we want the font size to be 16 pixels plus 3% of the viewport width. So we're essentially here setting a minimum font size. The browser knows that the font size starts at 16 pixels. It's not going to go below that. And then it starts adding 3% of the viewport size as the viewport changes. Now, we solved the minimum font size, we solved the zooming problem, but we still have the max font size. I don't want to have to use a media query for that. So as Mike says, it appears that by using calc and viewport width, we can get responsive typography that scales perfectly between specific pixel values within a specific viewport range. This means that you can have perfect smooth scaling between any two font sizes over any viewport range. The font will start scaling and stop scaling exactly where you want it in just one line of CSS, which looks like this. This is a rule. I tried memorizing it and failed a million times. But basically, you just specify what's the minimum font size you want, what's the maximum, where do you want the range, the minimum viewport size, the maximum viewport size. You put those into this formula, and it's going to work like magic. You'll have text that scales up and down as you want it to, using just one line of CSS. Now, Mike has this code pen which explains how it works. He even has a table and the viewport sizes, font size in pixels, how to choose the viewport widths and dimensions. Calc is a function that has really good browser support. So if you still have to support one of those older browsers, one, I feel sorry for you, and two, you can use calc. You can use calc as an enhancement. So you would have, for example, font size 20 pixels, and then right after it, font size calc 20 pixels plus something. And the browser is going to use it as an enhancement where it's supported. All about this technique is here. Now, some people even took this technique further to specify the line height that also changes and scales as the width of the line changes. Because the wider the line, the longer the line, the more space you need vertically. But that is outside the scope of this talk here. Another challenge when it comes to accessibility is link underlines. So the accessibility guidelines tell us to make sure that we do not rely on color alone to distinguish links and even explicitly suggest underlines. Usability researchers and practitioners generally suggest that underlines are the most clear way to indicate a link that lives within content. We're not talking about headings, we're not talking about footer links or navigation here. Links within content. Academic researchers confirm that there's a cognitive load to even having links inside of content, but you can decrease that load by adding underlines, which is a very clear visual way of indicating that this is actually a link. I stole these from this excellent article by Adrian Roselli. Totally 100% recommended. If you're not sold as to why you should use underlines, definitely read this. He has everything covered from accessibility, usability, and everything in between. So I'm personally convinced that underlines are really important, but who said that text underlines have to be ugly? So one of the requirements in the new Smashing magazine was we had these text underlines, and at first I thought, okay, it's easy. I could just use a background color, gradient, whatever, because I cannot, okay, or whatever standard techniques we have in CSS. I'll get to those shortly. But there was this thing here that the descenders are not being crossed over by the line. And I didn't know of any way to do this using CSS. So ideally, we would be able to customize underline links and underlines for links in CSS, but it's not really that possible yet. So the ideal links, or the underlines, would be, the technical solutions for those would be change the width of the line. We should be able to change the width, make it thicker or thinner, change the distance from the text as we want, change the color, clear the descenders. We do not want any ugly overlap, and perhaps have a separate style for visited links. Now, these points were mentioned in this article by Marcin Witcher when he was discussing how he crafted underlines on Medium. And then there's this other really good article, which its title is CSS Underlines Suck. Basically, it summarizes all of the current hacks that we have to use to get those results that I previously mentioned. Because in CSS, we currently do have a way to make sure that text underlines do not overlap the descenders. It's called the text decoration skip property. But browser support is not very good. You can use it as an enhancement, but I think it would only work in Safari and Chrome, if I'm not mistaken. So most of the users will still get those ugly underlines. And if you're a designer, I know that you would not take that yet. So this could be used as an enhancement, but it's not supported yet. So I had to use one of the hacks in that article. And I have to admit, I had never even thought about using a hack to create anything before. I tried to find the cleanest solution for everything, but I couldn't do it this time. So I ended up using this technique here. Text color, the background color, wherever the text is located. In this case, it's green. Text shadow, and then the background image. So the line is a linear gradient background image. If you set a linear gradient background image to, for example, be a linear gradient from black to black, it would be a solid black. And then if you change the size of that background image to be 100% by 1 pixels, the linear gradient becomes a line. It could be 1 pixels, 2 pixels, 3 pixels, whatever you want the thickness to be. But in this case, you have the text and you have the underline behind it as the background image. It's still going to, it's not going to clear the descenders. So what we're doing here is we're using text shadow to create text shadow that is not blurred. Okay, so we're using it to create sort of an outline or a border for each letter. And because the text shadow is in the foreground and the line is in the background, the foreground is going to overlap the line and it's going to look like it's being cleared. This is a beautiful hack. But as you can see here, the text shadow and the background color behind the text have to be the same color. And as you can imagine, if you have text over an image, this technique would not work. But in Smashing Magazine, we didn't have that, so it was safe to use it. So this is what the CSS would look like. You have the color blue on the text, background image, linear gradient, which would be, in this case, for example, the same color. The line has the same color as the text. Background image, repeat, size, position, and a text shadow. Now, if you want to make it even more, better or cleaner, instead of specifying the color of the text again inside of the linear gradient, you can use current color variable. So the browser is going to automatically take the color of the text and use that as a line color. And it works. However, things get a little bit more complicated when you have multiple styles. So we have red text, gray underline, black text, blue underline, and then we have the same color underline and different color underlines. Repeating that exact same CSS property for each and every one of these styles could be tiresome. So I ended up creating a mixin. I would just specify the shadow color that I want, border color, and border width. It could be 1, 2, 3, so we have control over that inside of this mixin. And then each of those styles, black on blue, blue and whatever, has its own mixin in which I'm reusing the underlying mixin. And then I'm using these mixins wherever I want them in the CSS. SAS to the rescue. And this works. And most importantly, we have underlines. We have the design, a beautiful design. I think these underlines are beautiful, right? So we have these, and we have text that's 100% accessible visually. Now, content order and structure. One of the other challenges, which was the funniest sort of, or funnest challenge, was we had this requirement here. So basically, we had on the homepage of the New Smashing magazine, we have these articles which are positioned in a grid like that. And the way these work is when a user hovers over a grid item, they should be able to click anywhere on that item, and it would take them to the grid, to the article page. But we still wanted to make sure that any links inside of it are still clickable. For example, if you click on the author name, it would take you to the author page, not to the article page. So we have links inside of other links. I don't know why the content architecture would be like this, but I'm only the front-end developer, so I was just, I'm doing what I'm told to do. Okay. How do we do that? Now, in HTML, the HTML specification says that you cannot have an interactive element inside of another interactive element. An A tag, a link, is an interactive element, so you cannot have a link inside of another link, HTML-wise. So if you put this in your HTML, link inside of another link, the browser is going to parse it and interpret it as this. It's going to close the first one and leave the second one closed, and then you have this another child, which is just, it's not going to be a link at all. It's going to ruin everything. It's not going to work. How do you make it work? I had no idea until I found this article by Roman Komarov. Apparently, if you do this, it works. So because of the way browsers handle object elements, the object container is going to be completely ignored because it has an invalid MIME type, and allowing the content inside of it. So if you've ever worked with SVG, one of the ways to implement SVG is to use an object tag. So you reference the SVG inside of the object tag, and between the opening and closing object tags, you can provide any kind of content. That content is going to be used as a fallback if the SVG fails to load for any reason. Now, in this case here, the object does fail because it has a random MIME type, and what the browser is going to do is going to render the link inside of it, regardless of the outer context of the object. It's going to forget that the object is inside of another link, so you're fooling the browser into thinking that it's doing the right thing, but it's not really doing the right thing. So after wrapping any HTML with such attributeless object, we would get just a wrapper element for this content, but a wrapper with an unusual trait. Any content inside of it would be treated by the browser's parser without looking at the object's context. So using this trait, you can fool the browser into putting a link inside of another link. Cool. Everything you can read about that is in this article here. Now, this technique certainly works. However, for our use case in the magazine, it was completely impractical because we shouldn't have to set up a script to wrap every single link that we have in an object tag in order to make it work. As a front-end developer, I try to code so that my client has less work to do after they get my code. I don't want to have to hand something over to them and then tell them, okay, this works, but you have to do X and Y and Z to make it work as expected. I try to do things as clean as possible. So I found this other technique on the internet. Now, this code here, this JS bin, JS Fiddle, is by Harry Roberts, who's a CSS wizard. Basically, what Harry has here is using CSS layers, sort of, Z-index and layering in CSS, we're able to make sure that this nesting thing works without actually nesting the links inside of CSS. I'm going to show you how it works. Now, Harry's idea is brilliant because it does not require any extra elements to work, for example, but it has a problem. So if you try to tab, when you're building any kind of component, always keep accessibility in mind, always, before making any decision. So if I'm going to hack my way into putting a link inside of another link, how is that going to affect tabbing order? Because when you're talking links, you're talking about tabbing. A lot of people tab. The tabbing order in this case is internal link, internal link, internal link, and then the entire item. Now imagine having this for like 9 elements. Internal, 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 external, internal, internal, external. That does not make sense at least not for me. So this works, but I thought I needed a better way to make it work. So what I ended up doing is, first, to explain this technique, what's happening here, let me go to this slide here. So we have an element, the container, the grid item, the article. We have a heading, we have an internal link, another internal link, and then we have this arrow. Now, ideally, we would be able to tap 1, 2, 3, and then move to the other element, 1, 2, 3, without going 1, 2, 3, the whole thing, and then 1, 2, 3, the whole thing. So what we're doing here is, the heading is by default going to link to the article page, right? So using CSS pseudo elements like this, you set the position static on, I'm going to come back to this shortly. So we have a heading, okay? And then we include a pseudo element inside of that heading. We position the pseudo element absolutely so that it covers the entire item, not just the heading. So you're essentially technically expanding the heading, the area, the clickable area of the heading, because when you're expanding the pseudo element, you're expanding the element itself. So when the user clicks anywhere on that item, they will be clicking on the pseudo element, and therefore they will be clicking on the title, and that would take them to the article page. And this works perfectly. But when you're doing this, when you're positioning the item absolutely on top of the rest of the links, those links are not going to be clickable anymore, because anywhere you click, you're clicking the pseudo element. You can work your way around that by doing this. The rest of the links inside of the article get position relative and the z-index one. Z-index does not work without position relative. So you set that, and then you pull them on top of the pseudo elements. And that's how it works. No HTML is being hacked. Nothing changes at all. Using CSS alone, you can do this. Now, this does have a problem. First of all, the tabbing order. Title, author, link, and then the error, and then to the other one. Tabbing order makes a lot more sense. I don't have to include all of the techniques. Harry's technique and other techniques that I found online require you to add a read more link, either before or after the content here, and then use that to expand on the whole article area. I didn't have to do that. I didn't want to touch the HTML at all. And it works like this. However, this has a problem, and we were happy to compromise it, sort of, to make it work. Because we have a pseudo element that's covering the entire grid item here, you cannot really select this text. You can't select the links because you've pulled them on top of the pseudo element, but you can't select this text. It's not selectable. But then again, people are probably going to be clicking the links, and if they want to select this text, they can select it in the article page. Iconography. Remember how I said earlier that accessibility can sometimes push you to think about more creative ways to do things? That happened to me when I was trying to implement one of the SVG images that we had. So we used SVG, as you can imagine, for all of the iconography on the page, except with a few exceptions. So these drop caps here, they are, when the SVG contains a lot of details, a lot of small elements, a lot of effects, shadow effects and gradients and stuff like that, the file size of the SVG can eventually become too big to use. So in that case, it would be easier and better for you to use a PNG image that would be half or sometimes less than half the size of the SVG. So even if the SVG is a good candidate for the image, I mean, even if the image is a good candidate for SVG, SVG might not be a good candidate for the image. So you have to keep that in mind. What we're doing here is we're thinking about performance. Performance is one aspect of accessibility because you want to make sure that your website or applications or whatever perform well enough so that they do not exclude users on temperamental connections. Which technique you should choose? We have all of these techniques here. Object has a fallback, iframe as well, inline, background image, image tag. Which technique you should use? The answer is it depends. Depends on your project, it depends on what you want to do with it. These are some of the questions that I ask myself before choosing an embedding technique for SVG. If I just have one SVG image, I have to ask myself all of these. But it gets easier and faster with time. Is the icon just decoration? If yes, then you can use it as a background image. Does the icon have a smooth transition? If yes, then you might need to put it in line. Is the transition necessary or not? Is the animation just, decoration, or is it actually crucial for the functionality of the page? What kind of fallback suits the SVG? Does it have to be text fallback or just a PNG raster image fallback? You have to take all of these into consideration. If you inline it, what's the best for performance? If you inline it, how does it affect the markup? For example, These are old images. They have been replaced with newer ones in the design, but the newer ones had the exact same challenge when it came to implementation. So we had these plans, 3 plans in the new design, and we have text inside of these. Okay? These images replace headings. Like, we don't have an image that says supporter, then followed by an H3, for example, that says supporter. So the text inside of this image, inside of this SVG, needs to be searchable, selectable, using the mouse cursor, searchable, selectable, and completely accessible, just like regular HTML text. And it has to be inside of the SVG because it's inside of an SVG. Now, the best way to do this, the best way to get the accessibility of text in SVG is to just inline the SVG. Then the text is going to be searchable, selectable, and accessible, just like HTML text. But it wasn't possible for me to inline these because each one of these looked like this. This is just one. And we have 3. It's not still scrolling. So there was no way I was going to put that inside of the HTML. But I still needed the text to be searchable, selectable, and accessible. Now, if I reference and, I needed to apply the font face of the magazine to that text. Now, if I could have, for example, referenced the SVG externally and then go to the SVG, inside of the SVG, to set a font face definition in there and then reference the font file inside of the SVG, but that would be too much because why would I have to define the font twice in 2 different places? And if the images change, they're going to have to go to the new images, edit them, put new font declarations inside of them. That's not as clean as I would want it to be. So I thought, how do I make sure that this illustration is not in line, but the text is still in line? Now, the beauty of SVG is that it's both a document format and an image format. So you don't have to choose between either implementing it as an image or a document. This was my solution, or half of it. So I have an inline SVG. I'm referencing an SVG inside of the SVG. What I did, I took each one of those illustrations, I copied them, I created a copy, I removed the text from the copy. So the only thing remaining was just the image itself, the illustration, without the text. I referenced that illustration inside of the inline SVG. SVG inside of an SVG. Couldn't get any more meta than this, because SVG is a document, and you can reference an image inside of a document, HTML or XML, it works. Now the text, I put the text also in line, and what I had to do, I just had to do a little bit of extra work to position the text using X and Y attributes, to position it so that it is put inside of that sign, and that's it. The text is 100% searchable, selectable, accessible. The image is going to be cached. Performance is amazing. It's really good. And I got all the benefits of SVG. The HTML is clean, and it's performant. Now, just a note here. I kept this on purpose. Do not write all caps text inside of your markup, because screen readers are going to read that as SUPPORTER. So use regular text and then make it uppercase inside of CSS. And then you can style SVG text that just like you would with HTML text. You can give it a font family, a fill color. Instead of color, you have fill, and then a font weight, and it works. So the takeaway here is, first of all, thinking about accessibility pushed me to accessibility of the text and the performance of the image. I had to think of a better way to implement it, and I ended up, instead, you don't have to choose just one SVG embedding technique. You can choose multiple ones. And you get all the benefits of the SVG format. There were other things that I did on the magazine, small steps that you can do now. You don't have to ask for permission to make your websites and applications accessible. If you're a designer, you can design something that takes accessibility into consideration. If you're a developer, it's on a technical level. You don't really need permission to add an ARIA attribute, for example, or to add a specific text, as you're going to see next. Provide contextual context for icons. So sometimes we have icons that actually have a role, that have a functionality. They're not just decoration. For example, the back to top icon, or read more button, the arrow here, or the comment upvoting buttons. If a screen reader comes to these icons, and for example, if it just sees this arrow here, it's going to read out arrow. What does it mean? For us, it's obvious because we have a visual representation. We know what it represents and what it does, but screen reader users do not. So what you can do, which is really fast, really simple, you can do something like this. You could add a span. It does not affect the design at all. It's still accessible, and it's still looking the same as it is. Give it a screen reader only class, for example, and then hide it visually. Now, this is not the best way to hide text visually. This is a fairly old slide. There's a better way to do it. So you hide the text visually, but screen readers will still be able to see that, and they will know that this is actually a button that says read more. SR only text. You can add it anywhere. I do this in every single one of my projects today. So what you do here is you think, whenever you're creating something, think, how is an assistive technology, how is a screen reader going to read it out loud? On the HTML level, when you're writing your HTML, does it make sense? How's it going to be read out loud? Before going into the CSS stage, in the HTML stage, always think about accessibility and how the markup is going to be interpreted. If you're using SVG, for example, like the back to top button, the arrow, it's actually an SVG. SVG comes with title and description elements, which are title and description for the SVG. So in our case, you could use something like back to top. The screen reader is going to use that to read that out loud as back to top. Provide clues for content changes. So one of the other things that we had on the magazine is we had this fancy live search. Okay, so from a screen reader perspective, the screen reader goes through this content here. It knows there's a search input field on the top. But since everything is happening as live search, the screen readers, they don't really know that something has changed somewhere and that some new results have been shown. So what we can do is, you can use just a few, I think literally 4 ARIA attributes to solve this problem. First, you have to make sure, in our case here, we have a div that contains the search results, okay? So the first thing you can do is you need to tell the screen readers that this input element controls a div that has an ID search results. ARIA controls search results. The ARIA controls attribute creates a cause and effect relationship. It identifies the element or elements that are controlled by the current element when that relationship isn't represented in the DOM, which in our case it wasn't. The more widely the two elements are separated in the DOM, the more useful ARIA controls attribute comes. So if you have one element here that controls another here, just setting ARIA controls, the screen reader is going to know that this element here, this button, controls this one here. And if any change happens here, you need to give it just a little bit more help to announce it to the user. Now, when a user agent supports ARIA controls, it makes it possible for focus to be moved from the current element, say a button or an input field, directly to the element it controls, wherever it's located on the page. The alternative is to navigate. If you don't do this, the user has to navigate through all of the content in between these two to get to that, wherever the changes are happening. Now, the next thing you should do is go to the search results element, add ARIA Live, ARIA Relevant, and ARIA Atomic. ARIA Atomic is not even necessary because it's false by default. ARIA Live Polite and ARIA Relevant additions. What we're telling screen readers here is that this is a live region. Means that the content inside of this region is going to change. And when you say ARIA Live Polite, you're telling the screen reader to announce these changes to the user in a polite way, which is really nice. ARIA Relevant additions, so only announce additions to this region, so they don't have to go and re-announce everything that comes. Okay? A screen reader can only focus on one part of the page at a time. If something changes elsewhere on the page, which in our case was inside of the search results, there's a good chance a screen reader user will be oblivious to it. So when the update takes place within an ARIA Live region, a screen reader is automatically notified wherever its focus is at the time, and it conveys the updated content to the user. Without this, the user is not going to be able to use the live search that you've built. And it's only 4 attributes. You can also use this anywhere there's live changes, such as infinite loading. We have these comments here. If you're adding more contents, more comments, and you want to make sure that it's announced, the wrapper of the comments wrapper, give it an ARIA Live region, ARIA controls on this button, and you're done. You don't need permission to do that. You can learn all about ARIA Live regions in this MDN article. Provide content shortcuts. So one of the most useful things you can do for accessibility, and that literally does not take more than 1 or 2 minutes tops, is to provide content shortcuts. The main content on the page is not usually the first thing on a web page. You have a logo, you have a navigation, sometimes a mega navigation with tons of links inside of it. Keyboard, not just screen readers. Keyboard and screen reader users generally must navigate a long list of navigation links, sublists of links, corporate icons, site searches, and other elements before they ever arrive to the main content. This is particularly difficult for users with some forms of motor disabilities, having to keep clicking that. I mean, who wants to do that, even if you don't have any disability? And after, we're all only temporarily abled. So what you can do, and what I did for the magazine, nobody asked me to do it, was I added this. So when you're tabbing, when you arrive to the page, the first thing, if you're tabbing through the page, the first thing that you get is skip to main content. If you don't use that, you're going to keep tabbing through the rest of the page. And the skip to main content link disappears. So all you need here is an A element, a link. It says skip to main content. You put this before the header, before any kind of content on the page. And then you hide it visually. You hide it, it doesn't show up on the page. It's hidden somewhere outside of the viewport. And when it's focused, it is shown so that the user knows that they're actually focusing on something. They're not focusing on some ghost link somewhere. And if they click on it, the link, as you can see here, it links to the main section. So you would have, for example, a section ID equals main where the content actually starts. If they click on it, they go to the main content, skipping everything that comes before it. So some of the takeaways: do not treat accessibility as an afterthought. Seriously, you don't have to do that. If you treat accessibility as part of the process, it can push you to come up with really nice solutions. You're going to end up with components that work everywhere and for everyone. Think about accessibility on a component level. Don't wait till the end of the project when someone comes and says, hey, your application is not accessible. So you're going to have to go over everything, every component that you built, and make it accessible again. Let's admit it, nobody wants to do that. It's not fun. We have to do it nonetheless. So in order to avoid this, having to go over everything and wasting a lot of time, you can do it, and it gets easier and much faster with time. A lot faster. The foundation of accessibility is proper markup. Before thinking about CSS, think about HTML first. Write something you would be able to understand when CSS is disabled. Does the order look well? If you have a list, use a list item. If you have a table, use a table. Let's make sure that the content is, well, it makes sense. And think in small steps. Small steps like these will allow more people to use your products and interfaces. Small steps like these, small steps, big, what's that thing? The man that got on the moon, small step, big step for humanity? You are doing a big step for humanity here, seriously. It will make your products more inclusive. So let's build products that care about people. Thank you.